For time immemorial, there has always been certain factors that lead to a nation's success. Fertile land, natural resources, large populations, etc. But one region has consistently broken these rules and has achieved victory. That region is Scandinavia. Like many histories that I have covered, I constantly have the problem as to when I am to start the story, since by the nature of history, every event is a result of a previous event. So, just for brevity's sake, I will begin this story in the late 1700s. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the quick rundown in Scandinavia. In 1788, Sweden and Russia's navies faced each other in the Baltic Sea, but to nobody's surprise, it was an inconclusive affair that led to a white peace, as neither nation's navy was well equipped for large-scale warfare, and the front in Finland was static. The Kingdom of Sweden, ever since it existed, has found itself in constant struggle with the Russians, and throughout the 1700s, Sweden and Russia dragged each other through the mud all across Europe in some of the largest wars of the late Renaissance. The days of the Great Northern War have long since faded, and while observing the scene, the glory days of Sweden were over. The year is now 1792, and the French Revolution is in full swing. The dynamics of the old regimes of Europe are melting, as new liberal ideas such as nationalism and republicanism are being moved into the forefront of political theory. The old absolutist nations of Europe declared war on the French Republic, and for 5 years the invigorated French peoples defended themselves against the Old World. But, to Scandinavia, this French affair was seen as a distant sideshow. Year after year, the armies of the old regimes advanced into France, and again they would be met with the entire French nation against them. A far cry from the old days of limited warfare between two professional armies, the French people were fierce, and soon the whole world would know the fire that France could endure. The initial Scandinavian involvement in the War of the Second Coalition was on behalf of the Union of Denmark-Norway. Because of Denmark's neutrality in the previous coalition war, Britain saw Denmark as possibly being secretly in league with the French. Although untrue, in 1801, Britain attacked the Danish navy in a surprise attack, in order to declaw Denmark in the event that the Danish were to join Napoleon. Britain's aim was to establish an open naval lane with Russia, but because of geography, Denmark was in the way. If Denmark was to join the French, the Russians would be almost completely stranded on their own. The Danish navy fought well against the British fleet, but ultimately the Danish navy was forced to escape to Copenhagen, and Britain opened fire with their cannons on the houses and buildings in the city, killing hundreds. This clear breach of Danish neutrality led to Britain's fears becoming a reality, and had Britain not just attacked Denmark, the Danes might well have joined Britain against the French. Throughout the Napoleonic Wars, Denmark was consistently on the side of Napoleon, as Denmark wished to seek revenge for the massacre that Britain had committed off the coast of Copenhagen. However, Denmark's old rival would not let this good crisis go to waste, and in early 1805, Sweden polished off their rusty sword once more, and they declared themselves against Napoleon and his allies. Sweden was now on the path towards war, but for 3 years, Sweden made preparations for war against Denmark, building up their fleet and producing weaponry, and things seemed ready to boil over at any moment with Denmark, when suddenly a message arrived from Russia. In 1808, Russia issued an ultimatum to Sweden, demanding that they surrender all of Finland and the Åland Islands to Russia, or else Russia would invade the Swedish possession of Finland. Sweden had no other option, and in the haste, they moved most of their military arms and equipment eastwards to protect the open countryside in Finland. As due to treaties made previously, Sweden was forbidden from building fortresses in Finland. Russia was quickly able to advance into Sweden and Finland, and, to add to the chaos, Denmark declared war on Sweden in the same year. 1808 was Sweden's year of disaster. War on all sides of its borders, although, given Sweden's rapid military buildup, it was ready for a fight, as the borders of Denmark and Norway became a war zone. Day after day, the armies of Sweden were pushed further into the interior of their country, and pushed out of Finland. And thankfully, however, the front with Norway was relatively quiet, as Denmark and Norway were already too stressed fighting Britain to put up much of a fight against Sweden. The war with Russia is a disaster, and Sweden is forced into total chaos, as Russian soldiers began to enter Sweden proper. Panic shook the country, and frantic peace treaties were attempted, but time after time, the inept King Gustav III continually pushed for the war to continue. Things were getting worse by the day, and many people in Sweden believed that they would be invaded at any moment. But, on a cold morning on March 7th, armed men stormed into the palace and arrested the king. Gustav was placed under house arrest by the Provisional Reichstag government, and immediately the anti-war faction of the Swedish government managed to sign a peace treaty with Denmark, Norway, and Russia. The Peace Treaty of Frederikshamn put an end to the bloodshed, but at a great price. The treaty stipulated that Sweden give up all of its holdings in Finland, sell all of its small remaining colonial possessions, and give up the fortified islands of Åland to Russia. The borders of Sweden matched the borders of Sweden today, and ever since then they have remained the same. But there was a catch. The Kingdom of Norway rebelled against Denmark, as the Danes had led Norway into war with Britain, ruining Norway's economy and navy. By 1814, as the Napoleonic Wars ended for the first time, Norway had had enough of their Danish overlords, and in an act of rebellion, Norway signed a separate peace with all nations it was at war with, and became a permanent ally of Sweden. The royal families of Norway and Sweden married, ending the war between the two, and uniting the two countries as a union. Perhaps the saying is true, that love can overpower even the greatest of cannons. In the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, an unusual peace descended across Europe, and for the first time in over 30 years, there has not been constant bloodshed. For some countries, this was just the kind of respite they needed after the disastrous wars of the 1700s. For example, Denmark used to be a world-spanning empire, with colonies from Greenland to Africa to India, but after the financial collapse of the Danish economy, all of these colonial possessions were slowly sold off to foreign powers. The proud empire of Denmark was now a shadow of its former self. But, across the River Kiel, in the streets of France, there was a new revolution boiling. There are a select few years in history that you could call infamous. You see, although Napoleon had lost the wars, the ideas of liberalism spread like seeds in all of the nations it had conquered, and from these seeds bloomed an entirely new breed of dissent. The year 1848 is known as the springtime of nations, as these ideas of nationalism had finally bloomed. In France, the government of the Orleanist monarchy of Louis Philippe was overthrown by a liberal government in the style of the old French Revolution. This was the catalyst for unrest and revolution the world over. The year 1848 saw no less than 50 different revolutions in countries spanning across the globe, and Denmark was no exception. The conservative monarchist Holscher party had no troubles in Denmark itself, but the German-speaking areas of southern Denmark were brewing unrest. Here's the situation. The Empire of Denmark, ever since the 1300s, has controlled two regions in Germany, the regions of Saxe-Lauenburg and the region of Schleswig-Holstein. And these two areas are inhabited by native German people, but they're part of the Empire of Denmark. Thus, they're subject to Danish laws and government. Historically, this wouldn't have been a problem, as this was just part and parcel of countries back then to have a large minority population. The borders of countries without nationalism are not drawn along ethnic lines, but a result of centuries of inheritances and feudal wars. But in this new crucible of empires, people are no longer willing to stand to have such a foreign overlord. The patchwork of nations that became Germany and Italy were quickly becoming unstable, as the calls for unification deafened the old governments. The 50 or so small nations in Germany were becoming more and more determined to unify into one country, and the leader of this unification was the Kingdom of Prussia. Ever since the 7 Years' War, the Kingdom of Prussia has grown in size and influence more and more, and was now the premier nation in Germany. The First Schleswig War started in 1848, when riots spread throughout the province of Schleswig and Holstein after the King of Denmark illegally changed the succession laws, granting continual Danish rule over the Low Countries. The outraged rioters quickly became militarized with the help of weapon shipments from Prussia, and soon open war was declared between Denmark and any nation in support of the rioters. Immediately, the Danish army was dispatched south to put down the rebellion. The Danish army expected this to be an easy victory, but there were surprises waiting in store for them. The Schleswig forces had secretly taken the fortress city of Rendsburg in the middle of the night, and while the Danish army was crossing the River Kiel to try to enter Schleswig, rebel rifles and cannons opened fire on the Danes, sending them into a panicked retreat. This war was not going to be as easy as they thought. From 1848 to 1852, the Danish army continually made excursions into Schleswig-Holstein, and although the Schleswig militia was competent enough, other German nations were sending weapons and volunteers into Holstein to fuel the war effort. For example, the Kingdom of Prussia sent a detachment of 1,000 volunteers to fight against Denmark, but in order not to have an international incident, the Prussians signed a peace treaty with Denmark in 1850. Day by day, the Danish army advanced south into the rebellious provinces, and eventually Danish boots were trotting into the capital city of Kiel. Although the battles were small, there was constant friction in the province for years, as snipers and militia would never meet the Danes in open combat. The war-torn nation of Schleswig-Holstein conceded defeat, and in their surrender, the London Treaty of 1852 was signed, ending the war which killed thousands. In the aftermath of the First Schleswig War, Denmark was forced to sell off the rest of its colonial possessions, with the exception of their Arctic holdings. This was done in order to have Britain mediate the peace treaties with Schleswig. Denmark used to have colonies and fortresses in the African region of Ghana, and in India they had the cities of Tranquebar and Serampore. These were promptly sold to the British. In 1853, Finland was plunged into war as they were part of the Russian Empire. Finland was forced into the Crimean War, and throughout the Crimean War, the British Navy was constantly harassing Russian and Finnish ships in the Baltic Sea. In order to break the Russian morale, British ships would make raids on the coastal Finnish and Russian cities, and with their new cannons they shelled the coastal fortress cities of Åland, Bommersund, and Suomenlinna. Hundreds of Russians and Finns died in the naval raids by the British Navy, and at the end of the Crimean War, Finland was forced to demolish all of their coastal fortresses. Finland was humiliated in the Crimean War, and nationalist movements grew against Russia to try to let Finland be freed. But these dreams of independence would not be realized anytime soon. Back in Denmark, while the Danes rested, the Germans were busy. Ever since the early 1860s, the Kingdom of Prussia was kickstarting efforts to unite the 50 small German countries into one strong unified presence. After the Danes gave Prussia a bloody nose in 1850, Prussia has remembered the struggle in Schleswig. They drew plans to take back this land and have it be ruled by a Germanic country again. In 1864, the Schleswig-Holstein problem was revived, as the illegal edict that extended the Danish control over the region has expired. Now, the question of succession was brought back from the grave. After the death of Danish King Frederick VII, his nephew, Christian IX, ascended the throne. Because of this, the succession of Schleswig-Holstein was sent into turmoil. Thus, an international crisis was started as to who these duchies belonged to. There were two options that could have been taken. The first option was that Schleswig-Holstein could illegally remain under Danish control, extending the issue for the next monarch. The second option, however, was that Schleswig-Holstein could become an independent country, a member of the North German Confederation. Obviously, any losses on Denmark's part would be seen as a gain on Prussia's part. The situation finally boiled over when Danish soldiers marched into Schleswig-Holstein, violating the London Treaty and causing an international uproar. In response, the Kingdom of Prussia declared war on Denmark in order to reassert the Treaty of London and to bring the people of Schleswig-Holstein into the warm embrace of Germany. The Danish army retreated from Schleswig and began to garrison their fortress lines further back towards Denmark. The Prussian army, along with their Austrian allies, stormed through southern Denmark, and were met with light resistance, as all the Danish soldiers had more or less evacuated the area. Until now, there had only been a few hundred casualties in the war so far, as the Danes retreated. But this would change when the Germans encountered a roadblock. For years, Denmark had been fortifying the town of Djobel, and for days, Germany shelled the defenses with their newly acquired modern Krupp cannons. The Danish position at Dobel was dire, and if the fortress was captured, then the road would be open for the Germans to capture all of mainland Denmark. To lose Dobel would be a disaster, and finally, the day came. On the 18th of April, 1864, the German army assaulted the fortress of Dobel. The inexperienced and poorly led Danish were able to hold the fort for a few hours, as their defenses held out, but wave after wave of German soldiers rushed the position, overwhelming the Danes. The aftermath was a slaughter, as the Germans opened fire on the Danish soldiers retreating from the fort. But there was a silver lining to this cloud. The Danish navy had pulled off a miraculous victory at sea, as the Prussian navy was expelled from the waters around Djobel. This allowed the escaping Danish soldiers to take the waterways back to mainland Denmark, and saving the Danish army from completely being captured. But, even though some of the Danish army was saved, most of the army was captured. Over 4,000 Danish soldiers were taken prisoner by the Germans, and immediately afterwards, peace negotiations were beginning, although the soldiers on the ground were still dying. Peace talks droned on for months, but eventually, Christian IX of Denmark signed the Treaty of Vienna, ending the Second Schleswig War. The treaty had 3 points at which Denmark would be affected. Number 1, the provinces of Saxe-Lauenburg, Holstein, and Schleswig are to be occupied by Prussia and Austria, then released as an independent duchy under Prussian sphere of influence. Number 2, the Danish army is to be frozen in size, then reduced to a maximum of 50,000 men. Number 3, the fortresses of Djobel and Meissen are to be demolished, and the Danish-German border to be demilitarized to ensure peace. The humiliating peace treaty was the final nail in the coffin for the Danish Empire, and ever since then, Denmark has withdrawn itself from international affairs, becoming a neutral state. And to this day, Denmark has remained as such. Throughout the 1800s, Scandinavia became completely set aside by foreign affairs, and instead they became a haven for science and progress. In Sweden, advances in chemistry yielded results, as the famous chemist Alfred Nobel invented dynamite. Chemistry and other industrial advances thrived in the north. In Norway, their fishing and oil industry flourished, and new shipbuilding practices were developed. Around the world, naval architects from Scandinavia were sought after, so much so that the United States hired Danish and Norwegian designers to produce their new ironclad navy. As an act of friendship between Denmark and Germany, Danish designers were hired to help build the massive canal that would go through Schleswig-Holstein, connecting the Atlantic and Baltic Sea with a second route. As the years progressed, Scandinavia remained relatively at peace and growing, and the new modern age looked bright as the 1912 Olympics were hosted in Sweden. But the union that Sweden had with Norway was broken in 1905, as Sweden's royal family failed to produce an heir that would maintain the union between the two countries. But this event by no means soured the relationship between Sweden and Norway, and the two nations remained allied. The Archduke of Austria was assassinated by a Serbian bullet in 1914, and the world was plunged into chaos by the First World War. Scandinavia was neutral throughout the First World War, but Finland was forced to fight on the side of the Russian Empire, as they were duchy under Tsar Nicholas II. Finnish soldiers fought for the Russian Empire on the Eastern Front, and Finland acted as an important naval base for the Russian ships. The Finnish army was deployed along the Baltic coast, and they defended Russia as best as they could. But Finnish troops typically had low morale, as many Finns didn't want to have to defend Russia. This was not their war, they said. Abroad, ever since the 1890s, the German Empire was building up its navy more and more, and one of the many sparks that set off the world aflame was Britain being threatened by the German Navy. Throughout the First World War, the two countries' navies played a cat-and-mouse game, as neither side was willing to fight each other unless they had the full advantage. Eventually, the day came when Germany wanted to send their fleet into the open ocean, to open trade lanes with the rest of the world. On May 31st, 1916, 27 German battleships sailed north into the waters near Denmark. In response, Britain sent their entire fleet out to try to put an end to the German excursion. Over 40 British battleships sailed down to hunt the German navy. The ensuing battle off the coast of Jutland was the largest naval battle thus seen on Earth, and one of the only times ever when battleships directly fought other battleships. The two fleets met in the foggy waters, and they began to open fire. The German shells pierced the armor of the forward British battleships, blowing up 3 of the finest battle cruisers Britain could ever produce. The Germans then attempted to retreat before the majority of the British fleet could arrive. The Brits chased the German fleet southward, and firefights between smaller ships lasted long into the night. By the end of the battle, Germany had lost 11 ships, while Britain had lost 14. Neither side was particularly wounded by the battle, but due to Germany being unable to open up the waterways, the British blockade continued, making this a British victory. The blockade against Germany from the outside world strangled Germany from the vital resources it needed to operate. Imports such as food, metal, and cloth were stopped before they could enter Germany, and many people starved to death as Germany partially relied on food imports to feed its people. However, Germany was able to trade with Scandinavia for what little they could purchase. Sweden is famous for its high production of iron and steel, and Germany bought as much material as they could to feed their war machine. This trade deal between Sweden and Germany flourished, and soon diplomatic talks between the two nations veered towards forming an alliance. On multiple occasions, Germany demanded that Sweden and Denmark join the Central Powers and declare war against Britain. In response, the Scandinavian countries declared an edict of armed neutrality, where they would only join the war if they were attacked first. This was good enough for Germany, but for the time relations soured. In the east, the Russian Empire began to crumble as the war had destroyed the old order in Russia, and a revolution fermented. In 1917, workers began to strike and protest in the street throughout Russia. This slowly escalated into a full-scale rebellion. Russia cracked into two entities, the Soviet Union, which controlled the capital area around St. Petersburg, and the Loyalist government still loyal to the monarchy. Soon the Loyalist government was forced to end the war with Germany, and to begin the civil war against the communists. And in the chaos, the Duchy of Finland declared independence, but this was only the beginning. In Finland, there was a high amount of communist activity, but nowhere near the scale as seen in Russia. In order to maintain the integrity of their new country, Finland declared war on any leftist or communist group in the country, and thus the civil war in Finland began. The communist forces were concentrated in the south, and the anti-communist alliance was situated in the north, and in the southern cities. Without any support from the city centers, the communists were relatively easily pushed out of the country, and Finland rebuilt their country after 3 months of civil war. During the interwar years, Scandinavia experienced a time of rebuilding and growth, and with the money gained from the First World War's trade deals, Sweden was able to industrialize quickly. In Germany, as mandated by the Treaty of Versailles, the German nation was banned from producing tanks, as the country was forced to remain defenseless with a small army. But there was a loophole in the Versailles Treaty that Germany was able to exploit. Nazi Germany began negotiating with Sweden, and together the two made a deal in which Sweden would build tanks, and Nazi Germany would pay for them. For years, Germany was reliant on Swedish and Norwegian imported weapons in order to build their armies, until early 1936, when Hitler began openly revoking the Treaty of Versailles and remilitarizing Germany. According to the Nazis, all German peoples were brothers, and as such they should band together to defend themselves. But these calls for alliance fell on deaf ears, as Denmark, Norway, and Sweden cut ties with Nazi Germany, as they did not want to have to fight a war on Germany's behalf, and had nothing to gain from it. As the lead-up to the Second World War continued, Scandinavian sovereignty was again put into question. Between Finland and the Soviet Union, there are areas which were disputed. The region of Karelia and Sala were considered Russian by the Soviet Union, but the lands legally belonged to Finland. In late November in 1939, the Soviet Union issued an ultimatum to Finland: hand over all the disputed territories or face war. Finland refused, and the two nations were sent into conflict. Finland had large defensive complexes along their border with the Soviet Union, and the poorly equipped and led Soviet army attacked relentlessly into Finnish fortresses. The freezing cold temperatures and swampy forests swallowed the entire Soviet advance, and the Finns used the environment to their advantage. Almost 500,000 Soviets died, while only a few thousand Finns died. But, as the winter thawed, the Soviets gained momentum, and they were nearly at Helsinki when Finland called for peace. In the 3-month-long winter war, the Soviet Union had lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and all they had to show for it was some desolate Arctic land. After the Winter War, the Second World War had already begun, but the only action so far was the German invasion of Poland. Poland barely lasted a few months, and in the meantime Germany planned their revenge against Scandinavia. Germany unveiled their plan to conquer the north, Operation Weserburg. On November 9th, 1940, Germany attacked Denmark, and thankfully, instead of fighting back and reducing their country to ruins, Denmark surrendered only a few hours after the declaration of war had arrived. 50 people died when Germany annexed Denmark, but the resistance against the German occupation would last up until the end of the war. Then, Germany turns its attention towards Norway, and almost immediately German paratroopers landed in Norway. The German navies sailed into Norwegian harbors, and to the surprise of everybody, Norway actually fought back. For 2 months, the Norwegian army put up fierce resistance around the capital of Oslo, and the German navy took up heavy casualties as the Norwegian and British forces were a force to be reckoned with on sea. For months, the mountains and snow, firefights, and the freezing temperatures killed thousands, but eventually, the German army was able to move into Oslo, and Norway surrendered. The Norwegian and Danish royal families escaped the country, and Nazi Germany established a puppet state in Norway, and used it as a base of operations for its submarine fleet and air force. The Germans put the infamous politician Vidkun Quisling as dictator of Norway, and under his leadership Norway turned into a fortress. As the Second World War dragged on, Germany was again forced into conflict with the Soviet Union, and Germany would need every ally it could get. Talks between Finland and Germany flourished, and German soldiers moved into Finland to act as the northern spearhead against the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union and Germany clashed in the largest war the world had ever seen, and throughout all of this, Sweden had remained neutral. Finland was used by Germany to attack the major Russian city of Leningrad, and to be used as a base for the German navy. Time went on, and with time the German army was slowly defeated as millions of bodies piled up on the Eastern Front. Finland was no exception, and tens of thousands of Finnish soldiers died as the Soviet Union counterattacked. Eventually, like all things, the Second World War ended, and Finland was on the losing side. Finland had lost even more land, and they were forced to repay large amounts of money to the Soviet Union to repay the damage that they have done. In Norway, the fascist government of Vidkun Quisling was ousted. The royal family returned to their country in ruins, and after the war came the hardest part of all: rebuilding.